America.
Hey, Commissioner Field, are you still on?
Yes, Mr. President.
Thank you, Commissioner. Mr. English, are we still recording?
Mr. President, it would be helpful if staff has the remote control for the camera, if they could tilt it down just a little bit. Then, yeah, just so we can see the people in front of the bench. Thank you.
All right. Time is now 10:10 a.m. We'll go back on the record. Before we go any further in this matter, the president wants to express his extreme displeasure at this moment. We provide opportunities for the parties to confer with each other about procedural matters well in advance of any hearing in this matter. I've also provided an opportunity this morning to the parties to discuss any matters relating to procedure even before we got into the cases in chief. I would note, Ms. Hill, that Mr. Uda moved for admission of the direct testimony and not the rebuttal testimony, and perhaps that would have been the appropriate time for you to note your objection instead of blaming the commission. We rely on the council to conduct an orderly process, just like the commissioners try to conduct an orderly process. All right, so I understand there may be an agreement.
Yes, Mr. President, and I apologize for my frustration. I appreciate that the council should get together and get forth a procedural schedule or a procedural process. Mr. Uda recognizes that as well. That has been the practice of this commission to put direct and rebuttal on at the same time. And I fully recognize that I didn't catch that at the beginning. And again, I apologize. I mean, no disrespect. If anything, I am supporting the commission in all of their efforts in their rulemakings to address their procedural rules. I think that is fabulous. And all of the improvements that the president and the vice president and all the commissioners have made in the last few years. And because of that acknowledgement of the process that we normally follow, Mr. Uda has graciously agreed to continue with that process. He might need a little bit of extra time to relabel exhibits, but I think the hearing will go smoothly forward.
Mr. Uda, I'd like you to comment on that, please. So
Yeah, Mr. President, I've discussed the matter with my client. I think I didn't mean to mislead Ms. Hill in any way. And I've talked to my client. My client agrees that we'll just go ahead and put the rebuttal testimony in so that Ms. Hill can proceed with her cross-examination the way she had planned. It wasn't an intention to surprise her or anything else. And I kind of thought, I mean, we've kind of gone back and forth over the years about how we've done this. And I wasn't committed to any particular approach. It just seemed that for this hearing, this made sense. But, you know, I think I don't want to put Ms. Hill at a disadvantage.
Mr. Brown.
Mr. President, I don't have a whole lot to add. I would agree that the vast majority of commission hearings have involved the admission of direct and rebuttal testimony together. And this, I think it kind of stems from this idea that we kind of pick up where we left off the pre-filed record at hearing. So everyone's read the full record and can kind of go from there. But there have been maybe one or maybe two instances where we've tried the way that was proposed today, but I think it's more efficient to do direct and rebuttal all at once. So I certainly don't object. Thank you.
I would just note for the record that generally in a civil proceeding, the manner that was proposed by Mr. Uda would be the proper proceeding, but I would agree with the council that at least in my 16 months on the commission, we have done direct and rebuttal testimony together, given the nature of pre-filed testimony. So, Ms. Hill, I will now call on Mr. Uda to introduce the rebuttal testimony. Mr. Uda.
Thank you, Mr. President. If I just might confer with my co-counsel just for a second.
Of course.
May she approach?
No objection, or she may. All right, Mr. Uda.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Schiffman, I placed in front of you another document that is labeled pre-filed rebuttal testimony of Roger Schiffman on behalf of Caithness Beaver Creek LLC. Do you see that?
Yes.
Are you the same Roger Schiffman who prepared this document?
Yes.
And if I asked you the same questions today, would your answers be the same?
Yes.
Do you have any corrections or additions to make to your testimony?
There's no corrections I'm aware of.
At this time, I would move for the admission of CBC 3.
Ms. Hill.
No objection.
All right, CBC 3 is admitted into evidence. All right, Ms. Hill, you may pick up.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Schiffman, could you please refer to page 12 of your rebuttal testimony?
Yes,
At the top of that page, you're quoting the commission's standard for including a new resource in the supply stack for modeling, correct?
that's correct.
And you believe that Northwestern can only add a new QF to the portfolio if there is a PPA executed by both parties or if the QF has filed a petition with PSC, correct?
Yes, that's been past commission ruling.
And don't you agree that once a QF establishes a legally enforceable obligation, that Northwestern should add that resource to its supply stack?
No,
Don't you agree that if a QF does nothing to establish a LEO and then just files a petition with the PSC, then they would be in front of another QF that established a LEO?
when you say they would be in front of, what do you mean exactly?
Let me rephrase it. Do you agree that if a QF does nothing to establish a LEO and then files a petition with the commission that they don't have a LEO?
I mean, I'm not really qualified to testify on whether an entity has a LEO or not. That would be something that would be litigated with a petition that they filed.
But didn't you just say that if a QF establishes a LEO, that Northwestern should add them to the resource stack?
I said no.
Oh, I'm sorry. Right. Isn't it true that Northwestern has an application before the PSC for approval of the Beartooth battery?
I'm not familiar with the details of the case, but I understand there is an application, yes.
Let's switch to power sim modeling. Do you believe that Northwestern should have modeled the battery operation as a static profile regardless of the system needs in each hour?
I believe they should have modeled it as a hybrid project, the way it would operate by Caithness having control of the battery. I think within the record, the best proxy for that is the profile that Caithness had presented.
Does that profile address the needs in each hour?
Within the modeling, no.
Now switching, your testimony covers a lot of topics, so I'm switching to the effective load carrying capacity.
Okay.
Isn't then that effective load carrying capacity for the court reporter's benefit, it will be referred to as the ELCC? Isn't it true that many jurisdictions use an ELCC study to determine how much reliable capacity can be expected from some resources?
Yes, that's true.
Now, if you could turn to Table 8 on page 21 of your rebuttal testimony.
Yes.
Is the purpose of this table to show that the volumes in Northwestern's witness, Mr. Steinmetz's Exhibit 1 are substantially less than Northwestern's wholesale volumes that you found?
Yes, that's correct.
And the time period you looked at was 2017 to 2021, correct?
Yes.
And isn't it true that from 2017 to 2020, Northwestern had significant hedge transaction volumes where there was no energy transmitted?
I'm not aware of Northwestern's hedging activities.
Isn't it true that when energy is not transmitted, you don't need transmission?
Yes, I don't think you would need transmission if energy is not transmitted.
And isn't it true if there's no transmission of energy, then there's no transmission cost?
Presumably, yes.
And isn't it true that if one party is a seller and another party is a buyer, then there's two parties to a transaction?
Yes.
And if the first party pays all the costs of the transaction, then there's no cost for the second party, correct?
Are you referring specifically to transmission costs?
No,
I'm a little confused by the question. If you can break it down, that might be helpful.
If you and I enter in the transaction costs $5 and I pay $5, do you owe anything?
I'm just confused by when you say a transaction, I don't know what the transaction is. If the transaction is allocating $5 of costs and you're picking up all that cost, then I wouldn't owe anything for cost, but there must be some other nature to the transaction that I'm not understanding.
Okay, fair enough. Could you refer to table 9 of page 22 of your testimony?
Yes,
This is supposed to be a comparison of Mid-C and Montana prices, correct?
yes,
And in response to data request 58, you provided Excel spreadsheets behind this table, correct?
yes.
And Mr. Vice President, I've already handed out some exhibits or some documents. If we could refer to those. Mr. Schiffman, could you refer to the document that I handed out that has the yellow highlight on it?
Yes,
Does this look reasonably close to the Excel spreadsheet you provided in response to Northwestern 58 in support of table 9?
yes, subject to check. I believe this was the summary data that were contained in that spreadsheet. There was also more detailed data.
And if you look at the bottom left-hand corner of that handout, you looked at, when you did this table, you looked at 6 months of data, correct?
Yes,
And you looked at September 21 to February 22, correct?
yes,
And are you aware that Northwestern joined the energy imbalance market in mid-June?
I am, yes.
And isn't it possible that in July and August of 2021, Northwestern had the most negative basis Mid-C?
Objection, question calls for speculation and lacks foundation.
Ms. Hill?
I'll rephrase the question. Mr. Schiffman, on, let's look at the highlighted rows. Let's just move to the highlighted rows. What do those names in those rows represent? Could you start from the left and move to the right?
My understanding is these represent different buses or pricing points within the EIM market for Northwestern Territory.
Do they represent interconnection maybe between Northwestern and its neighbors, like Idaho Power?
I don't know. These all look to me like buses within the Northwestern system, but I may not be familiar with the buses on the border.
Did you pull this data?
I pulled these data from Energy Velocity, and these were as far back as, I mean, when I ran the query, these were the data that were provided by the query.
Does this, but that query was subject to the search terms you put in the query?
No, that was the only data that came out of it. I didn't limit the search times.
Let's go with some terms that maybe look familiar to the commission. The third column, NWMT PAC W coal strip. Can you describe what that represents?
My presumption is it's EIM pricing point at Colstrom.
And do you understand that PAC might be Pacificor?
Could be, yes.
And then the next column, it's the same type of description. Do you think that PGE might be Portland General and Electric?
Could be, yes.
But you don't know.
No, I just pulled a query for whatever was listed as a Northwestern EIM pricing point in Energy Velocity.
And is it possible that that next column PSE could be Puget Sound Energy?
Yes.
And there's nothing on here that talks about Northwestern's ownership of Colstrip, does it?
No, these are just EIM price points.
I have no further questions for this witness.
Mr. Brown. No questions. Thank you, Mr. President.
We're going to now go to staff counsel for Cross, Mr. Hamilton.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Thank you, Mr. Schiffman. Just a few points that I'd like to try to clarify from your testimony. Your analysis of the transmission basis differentials relies on data from July of 2017 through June of 2019 from the Apex docket. Is that correct?
For the transaction part of the basis differential, not for the transmission cost part of the differential.
Okay. Is that historical data from the Apex docket in evidence here?
I believe it's in evidence in a data response provided by Mr. Steinmetz.
In your opinion, would it be better to rely on more recent information?
It would be, but I haven't seen that information updated by Northwestern.
Then prior to filing the petition in this docket, did you or did CBC take any action to obtain more recent information?
We didn't. We don't really have an ability to do that because those were proprietary data provided by, when I don't know they're proprietary, but they were provided originally, presumably on the Apex docket, but I think even before that in potentially some of the Con Ed cases in response to data requests that were issued to Northwestern after the proceeding had begun.
Okay. Could, or perhaps should, the commission use the basis differentials that were presented on remand from the CBC 2 case, the last CBC docket in this proceeding?
I'm not recalling exactly what those were.
Okay. Do you have any reason to doubt what those were, or to doubt the accuracy of those basis differentials?
I guess I would need to know more information about how they were derived.
Shifting gears slightly here. You discussed, and I think Ms. Hill already asked you some questions about the standard for determining when a resource is included in the portfolio. Is that right?
Yes.
And the standard that you described in your testimony looks for an application under Montana Code Section 69-3-603, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Since that section of code only applies to QFs, has the commission ever provided a standard for non-QF resources?
I'm not aware whether they have or not.
Okay. For those non-QF resources, is it your testimony that there should be an application for pre-approval before they're included in the portfolio?
That's my understanding of what the policy or rules suggest, but I don't believe it's required.
Okay. What is your understanding based on?
My understanding is just based on observing really the proceeding that Northwestern had begun for approval of the Laurel Station, the battery, the Beartooth battery, and then their subsequent withdrawal of that application, but their testimony that they're continuing or planning to continue moving forward. So I'm not an expert in that area of commission rules.
Okay. Do you have your direct testimony in front of you?
I do, yes.
Could you refer to page 16 of your direct testimony?
Yes.
Okay. On that page, you refer to a firm called, I think it's pronounced Ventyx, VENTYX/ABB.
Yes.
Who is Ventyx?
Ventyx began as Henwood Energy Services, and then they became Global Energy Decisions, and they became Ventyx, and then they became ABB, and then now they're called Hitachi Energy. So
Okay.
they're a firm that basically does price forecasting in the power sector, and they're also the owner of the Energy Velocity product.
Okay. So the projection that you mentioned in your testimony, is that available in some sort of presentation or report or document?
Could you clarify what you mean by the presentation?
Yeah, give me one moment here. So at the top of page 16 of your testimony, you refer to professional forecasting firms such as Ventyx ABB project continued high frequency of natural gas resources, setting prices at the margin even over the long term. So they project continued high frequency of natural gas resources. That projection, is that available in a report, presentation, or document form?
It would not be available publicly. It would basically be, it would be available to clients that subscribe to their forecast. Although in the Jawbone proceeding, Jawbone had presented a vintage of the ABB price forecast, basically in, I think, rebuttal testimony. And so those data would be viewable publicly by the commission and would show the pattern I'm talking about.
Okay,
Well, they would show the heat rate aspect. They wouldn't show the aspect that gas, I don't think it showed how often gas units are on the margin.
okay. Is that information from the Jawbone docket in the record here?
No.
Mr. Borison testified, first of all, have you reviewed Mr. Borison's pre-filed testimony?
Yes.
Okay,
Mr. Chairman, Mr. President, Mr. Vice President, I'm not sure what I'm supposed to call you now. If council has questions about Dr. Borison's testimony, he should direct those questions to Dr. Borison and not to Mr. Schiffman.
I agree with Mr. Uda. I don't intend to ask him about Mr. Borison's testimony. Instead, I'd like to refer you to page 16 of your own direct testimony.
Yes.
And I believe that's the page where you'll find table number 3. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And that table shows the correlation between natural gas prices and electricity prices.
Yes.
Okay. Is there any evidence in our record beyond this correlation analysis that we can refer to support your conclusion that natural gas prices set the marginal price?
Council, could you repeat that question, please?
Absolutely. Mr. Schiffman, is there any evidence in your presentation that the commission can rely upon to justify your conclusion that natural gas prices set the marginal price?
I know Dr. Borison had presented data in his testimony that shows, patterns on prices, both electricity and natural gas and market heat rates. My testimony is based on these data. It's based on the fact that I used to work at Ventyx/ABB and for, the past 20 years have been involved in running, production cost models like ProMed and developing those types of price forecasts. So I'm well aware that the output of those price forecasts shows how frequently natural gas resources set energy prices on a forecast basis and on an actual basis in the WCC.
Okay, thank you. Instead of tying the energy price forecast that we would use in this docket to a forecast of natural gas prices, could we instead just use a forecast of energy prices?
You could use a forecast of energy prices, yes.
Is there a reason why we wouldn't use a forecast of energy prices instead of a forecast of natural gas prices?
Well, the reason, in my view, is just past commission precedent. I mean, in I think the CBC two case, CBC had presented an Encompass model, which was a fundamentally derived forecast of electricity prices using a model such as they used Encompass. You can use ProMod. So the reason that we haven't selected that approach is because the commission has not utilized that approach in any QF case that I'm aware of.
Okay. Under your application of the condition 1, 2, 3 method, will CBC pay the marketing cost of energy in condition 3 sold to market?
CBC will pay its own costs. It won't pay any additional costs.
So maybe my question isn't precise enough. Will CBC pay the costs that Northwestern incurs to market CBC's energy during condition 3?
CBC won't pay any of Northwestern costs, no.
Why is that reasonable?
Well, it's reasonable because the structure of their PPA is they're delivering energy to Northwestern for a price. Your question is more focused on how do you derive that price, which is, you know, really the analytic process we're using, you know, either Northwestern or CBC in this case, which, you know, allocates those cost components. But in terms of CBC delivers energy to Northwestern, Northwestern has, you know, both its operations, its marketing department, those are already in place. They're already operating. So there's nothing in the PPA that would have Northwestern covering costs.
There's nothing in the PPA that would have Northwestern covering the costs of marketing CBC's energy?
Right.
Okay. You agree that the hourly method, condition 1, 2, 3 method is more accurate than the monthly method. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. If the choice was just between those two models, then what would be your preference, an hourly or a monthly condition 1, 2, 3?
My personal preference would be due to the hourly.
Okay. I understand from your testimony regarding carbon costs that there are many jurisdictions where a cost of carbon may be assigned. Carbon may have a value. Is that your testimony?
My testimony is the markets that, I mean, that is my testimony, but it's the markets that influence energy price formation at mid-sea have carbon costs built into them.
So how would the cost of carbon in those jurisdictions then affect the price that Northwestern pays to buy energy? Is that reflected in the market cost forecast?
You could argue that it's implicitly reflected in the short-term forward curve, but any escalation in that carbon component is not reflected.
So the natural gas escalator that you propose to use in this docket doesn't include that cost of carbon component.
Right.
Okay. Okay, I think that answers my question on carbon. Would it be reasonable for the commission to average the evidence that we've had in the record about other regional utilities market price forecasts to arrive at a sort of midpoint between those forecasts?
Could you be more specific when you mean what you mean by you say other utilities?
I believe that we have in the record here from a number of witnesses, the forecasted energy prices from a variety of utilities. Are you familiar with that evidence?
I'm familiar that Dr. Borison had presented some evidence. I think he's more familiar with those particular forecasts than I am.
I appreciate that. We'll save that for Dr. Borison. Where in your rebuttal testimony do you address the proposal to use locational marginal pricing?
I don't recall addressing that in my rebuttal testimony.
Okay. On page 12 of your rebuttal testimony,
Yes.
You said that Northwestern's application and data responses in docket 2021.02.022, which was the former Laurel and Beartooth pre-approval docket. You say that those responses suggest that Northwestern will face challenges seeking recovery. Do you see that in your testimony?
I'm sorry, is this my rebuttal testimony, did you say?
Yes, sorry, your rebuttal testimony at page 12. It's at the very bottom of that page.
Yes.
Okay. Could you be more specific for us? What are you referring to?
My understanding of that case was Northwestern had filed specifically with respect to Laurel for pre-approval from the commission and then subsequently withdrew that case. Prior to the withdrawal, I had been engaged to develop some data requests in that case. So what I'm specifically referring to is I had some questions about really the design of the RFP in that process and whether it sort of skewed the selection of Laurel as a preordained outcome. And so what I'm talking about here is my understanding based on I believe Mr. LaFave testified about it, and just based on public knowledge that Northwestern has indicated they intend to go forward with Laurel as a resource. My presumption is that some of those same questions I had about, really the fairness of the RFP are likely to come up whenever they ultimately seek rate approval.
Okay, thank you. If the commission finds that the Laurel Generating Station, or I guess what was formerly known as the Laurel Generating Station, should be included in the portfolio, is it still reasonable to use the RICE generator, the RICE generator, as the avoided resource for capacity purposes?
I believe you should use the RICE resource or technology type for avoided capacity in any instance or any circumstance.
Gotcha. Any circumstance, meaning with or without that generating station in the portfolio.
Right, because Northwestern in all of its planning activities has indicated it believes that in terms of thermal resources, that's the type of capacity it needs.
Okay. Can I now refer you to page 22 of your rebuttal testimony? And that's table 9, which I believe Ann, Miss Hill, excuse me, already asked some questions about.
Yes,
Okay. Most of the data in that table is after the LEO date that CBC is advocating for here. Is that correct?
yes.
So do you intend for the commission to rely on that information to set avoided costs?
I don't. This was presented really as, that's not what was built into our estimate of avoided costs. This was just some additional data to consider for the commission in interpreting what should be the mid-C to Montana differential. So it was really presided. It wasn't, I don't intend it or didn't intend it as a proposal, more just as additional evidence in support of CBC's position.
So it's your testimony that that information shows that CBC's position is more reasonable.
Yes,
Okay. Okay. Could you explain why?
because it actually shows a positive Montana basis relative to mid-C, whereas the dispute between Northwestern and CBC on the Montana differential, Northwestern for sales thinks that it should be a -$8, where Montana would be $8 lower than mid-C. So this, in my mind, suggests or provides additional evidence that the basis differential should be smaller or closer to what CBC is proposing than what Northwestern is proposing.
Mr. Schiffman, do you have any sense of how those figures would change over time?
We haven't done a forecast of that, no.
And this is getting to the end here. At page 23 of your rebuttal testimony, you describe an inflation rate that steps down over time. Is that correct?
It is correct. I'm simply citing testimony by Dr. Borison and Mr. Cafaro, so I'm not really the right witness to talk about that forecast.
Okay, so if Mr. Borison's testimony shows something different than a step down inflation rate, we should refer those questions to Mr. Borison, and you would defer to his analysis of the inflation rate?
Yes, definitely.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Mr. Vice President. That's all I have.
Thank you, Mr. Hamilton. We'll move on to commissioner questions. I would again remind commissioners that cross-examination your questions must be limited to the scope of the questions offered in testimony today. With that, Commissioner Fielder, do you have any questions for this witness?
No, thank you, Mr. President, Mr. Chairman, I mean.
Commissioner O'Donnell?
Thank you, Mr. President. Under the condition 3, just to follow up on your comments with Mr. Hamilton, the marketing costs, do I understand you correctly that marketing costs should not be pertinent to anything because Northwestern already has a marketing department? So any additional costs that any additional transactions should be just ignored because the department is already there? Do I understand correctly?
I mean, I don't have any testimony or really any expertise on Northwestern's marketing costs, but in general, the response to your question is yes, they already are marketing power as has been indicated in my testimony. So that department exists, and whether there would be any incremental costs associated with the Caithness project being on their system, I don't know.
Or any project.
Correct.
An additional workload, everything has to be quantified, I should think, from a business perspective. So you're saying that no quantification should occur in that case, to say, well, you're doing this anyway, so there's no additional cost to you.
Correct.
Okay, thank you. Carbon costs. I seem to, from again, your discussion with Mr. Hamilton, that I think you referred to different entities impose carbon costs, but some don't.
Within the WCC, that's correct.
Okay, then why should this commission honor carbon costs?
Well, the commission doesn't have to honor carbon costs. It's a question of what costs are Northwestern avoiding by having the CBC projects, which don't have any emissions, online. And so the costs they're avoiding are the costs that are implicitly built into the mid-sea energy price. And so my point on carbon costs is that there are, as I discussed with Mr. Hamilton, there are already implicitly some carbon costs in the mid-sea forward prices, say from ICE, that are used in this case for the first 2 years by CBC and the first 4 years by Northwestern. But there are additional, but the carbon for the states or provinces that impose carbon costs or regulate carbon in some way that results in carbon costs showing up in energy prices, those carbon costs are all projected to increase. And then additionally, entities like the state of Washington are bringing programs online that don't exist currently. So there will be an increase in the carbon cost that will be implicitly included in mid-sea energy prices, which aren't reflected in either the CBC or the Northwestern forward curves.
I appreciate that answer. And, my you are involved in this in a much more professional by vast amounts than I have. But I just thinking about the carbon costs, it doesn't seem to have caught on as a general to include it in the mid-sea to say that some jurisdictions have it and some don't. I don't know that should be relied upon that much. Is my understanding that the first time that this commission allowed carbon costs was in the acquisition of the dams prior to my being a commissioner here. And that was because they were roundly assumed that was in the future. Then President Trump was elected, and this commission immediately dropped that because they said it's no longer immediately anticipated. And then a year and a half ago, when a different philosophy took over, I would have expected that carbon costs scheme would have been roundly proposed and anticipated, but that has not happened. So why are those carbon costs implicitly included in the mid-sea prices? I don't understand why that is so, since it's not universal but localized.
Well, my understanding of the history you recite, which is generally accurate, is that at the time, say that Northwestern had the hydro acquisition case, there was a I would say a clear expectation in the industry that the federal government would impose some sort of a carbon program or carbon regulation program. Federal legislation that was proposed at that time never moved forward. And so the EPA basically moved forward with several different proposals to try to impose that regulation, all of which, some of which survived court challenges in terms of saying that EPA is required to regulate carbon, but none of which survived court challenges about the specific rules or programs that EPA had proposed. And my understanding of the Biden administration, which I think is what you mean by the change you're referring to recently, is EPA is trying to take another run up that hill But basically, in the meantime, as sort of federal regulation of carbon didn't survive or didn't move forward, individual states and individual provinces in Canada move forward with their own regulation of carbon. And so what's currently in the mid-C price, and even what would currently be forecast to be in the mid-C price, is to reflect those state and provincial carbon programs. So those are in place, even given federal government non-action.
Well, just one other question, and that is that if a contract had been consummated 5 years ago and included carbon costs, what would have happened to those ratepayers' additional costs? Where would they have gone? The whole carbon scheme, I say that in a scientific way, not in a demeaning way. The whole thing is that it would eventually balance out. But it seems to me that including carbon costs when it is not part of an overall scheme is a windfall to the QF. The developer is getting those carbon costs and they just go right in their pocket. But in the meantime, ratepayers are paying for that. That seems to be inequitable. You comment on that?
Yeah, it's really just a question of at each point in time when we're doing one of these cases, or if, Northwestern is engaging in an arm's length, negotiated transaction, entities are developing forecasts of what do they think is going to happen. And so at those times, people are forecasting what they think power prices are going to be, and whether there is or not carbon regulation is, one of the pieces of that forecast. And definitely there will be forecast error and things built into the price that may or may not happen.
Well, and thank you. PURPA calls for us to determine the avoided cost, not the possible avoided cost, the anticipated, the maybe this, the maybe that, because politics moves around so much. It seems to be pretty unfair on that. Have you ever come across any contracts that exist or proposed that would say that a contract in its initial stage would reflect the actual avoided costs, but should carbon costs be imposed, that at that time that would be an avoided cost and should be included in the contract?
I haven't reviewed a QF contract that has those provisions, no.
Would you think that would be a reasonable way to approach things?
I think it could be reasonable. It depends really on, and I don't want to get too far into, legal stuff here, but my understanding is that, state jurisdictions where, say, there's an organized market like California or Pennsylvania, contracts of that type can be used for, you can use basically the market prices as avoided costs. But in states like Montana, as I understand it, in order to move to that type of an approach, there needs to be some rulemaking done.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Commissioner Panocci.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Schiffman, I'm listening to Mr. Uda's concern of who controls the battery, and I see you have some testimony on that. If my room was full of ratepayers, I think a question they'd like me to ask you is, if Northwestern controls the battery, does the ratepayer have a better deal? Or if they do not control the battery, does the ratepayer have a better deal? Can you answer that and tell me why?
If Northwestern controls the battery and operates it the way that they've done in their forecast in terms of how it's been modeled in Power Zone, the ratepayer would have a better deal because there's a subsidy that's basically built into that process.
Thank you. No more questions.
Thank you, commissioners and Mr. Hamilton. Ms. Hill, do You have recross.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. I just have one, or a couple of questions, Mr. Schiffman. Could you refer to your exhibit RS1 and the excerpt from it that I gave you that has the green highlight in it?
Yes, okay.
Do you recall earlier this morning, you said that these prices don't include carbon, right?
Yes,
But then you just said that the mid-C prices will implicitly include carbon, right?
if I don't want to mischaracterize, but I believe your specific question earlier was whether the EIA natural gas escalator includes carbon. That's what I said, no.
And is there any disconnect between your forecast that doesn't include carbon, but the mid-C prices have an implicit cost of carbon?
There's not a disconnect because the growth in the carbon is the part that's missing from this forward curve.
That's all I have.
You tell Mr. Brown anything?
No, thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Redirect, Mr. Uda.
Just as a question of clarification, am I supposed to refer to you now as vice president or president?
Hey, I long time ago learned to answer to anything, but I think really what we had in mind was whoever's sitting in this chair still is chairperson. So we can actually use that comfortable term to the individual sitting in the chair,
Okay,
if that works for y'all.
that works fine for me.
Okay.
I just have a few questions. Mr. Schiffman, do you recall that Ms. Hill asked you some questions about why you didn't prepare an independent forecast?
I recall some questions along those lines. I don't know if you asked me that specific question.
Well, did she ask you questions about whether this was your forecast or whose forecast it was?
Yes,
Okay, was this your forecast?
this was my forecast in the sense that we utilized, commission precedent for using the mid-C forward prices as published by ICE and then escalated them at EIA natural gas prices, which has been a commission precedent for many QF cases. It's a methodology that was initially developed by Northwestern. And so it's my forecast to the extent, it's my forecast of forward prices following what I understand to be commission precedent methodology for developing avoided cost.
And did you provide any testimony on LMPs?
Other than some cross-examination, I don't recall testifying about LMPs.
And I believe you said in response to Ms. Hill's question about the use of LMP pricing that you would have some concerns about using it. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Could you explain what you meant by that to the commission?
Yeah, my concerns is what I understood Ms. Hill to be asking is whether which was similar to, I think, Commissioner Bonocci's question, was whether avoided costs would just be based on the real-time LMP. So there's two concerns I have with that. One, as I responded to Commissioner Bonocci, my understanding process-wise is for the commission to adopt that as an avoided cost methodology, they would have to go to rulemaking to do that, and that rulemaking has not been done. And then my second concern is I think the supply demand characteristics and the nature of what is the EIM market is not similar or adequately representative of like a day ahead type market or the type of market that you would utilize typically to forecast or to even understand energy transactions or energy markets.
And Commissioner O'Donnell asked you a question about averaging forecasts by different entities. Are you?
I believe that was Mr. Hamilton.
Oh, sorry. Better memory than I have. So Mr. Hamilton, I stand corrected, asked you questions about averaging different forecasts. What are your concerns about using that approach?
I have two concerns. One is Dr. Borison is more familiar with those forecasts than I am. And two, I don't really, I haven't studied those forecasts or believe they're really even in evidence in a way that could be usable by the commission.
Commissioner O'Donnell asked you a question. I think it was Commissioner O'Donnell asked you a question about why are ratepayers not getting a benefit if they're paying for something they're not getting? Do you recall that, like in
Yeah.
terms of carbon costs?
Yes.
Okay. Can you explain the benefit that consumers may get from having, even if there's not a quantifiable nature to it, from having renewables as opposed to fossil fuel power generation?
Well, there are environmental benefits. And then in terms of the market, what we're trying to present in our testimony is that they're also avoiding, what will be rising either implicit or explicit costs of carbon that will show up in energy price formation.
Right. So could you explain for the commission's benefit how it is that Northwestern is avoiding carbon costs by acquiring power from a resource that has zero carbon emissions?
Objection, leading.
I'll rephrase. Could you explain for the commission how it is the case that a zero emitting carbon facility would avoid costs that would otherwise be paid by consumers? And by the way,
Objection.
that's not a leading question. It does not imply a yes or no answer.
And Mr. Uda, I'm going to overrule the objection and you may answer, Mr. Schiffman.
Can you restate the question? Because I didn't fully understand.
Really? I went through all that effort twice. What I'm asking you to do is explain how it is that Northwestern could be avoiding a carbon cost by buying from a facility such as the CBC 1 and 4 projects in this proceeding when Montana doesn't have a carbon cost itself.
Well, because there are no carbon emissions from energy produced by the CBC projects. And Northwestern transacts a lot in the Pacific Northwest power market, which is tied to mid-C for price formation. And those mid-C prices do have a carbon cost component in them, which I believe will be increasing through time.
So how does that work exactly? I mean, in terms of Northwestern is avoiding making purchases at mid-C, they're avoiding carbon. Is that what you're saying?
They're avoiding both the electricity, say a carbon-free component of prices at mid-C and a carbon component that's implicitly built into those prices currently, yes. And that carbon component will be increasing through time.
That's all the questions I have. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Uda. Thank you all. Mr. Schiffman, you are temporarily excused.
Thank you, Chairman.
Mr. Uda, would you like to call your next witness?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would call the stand Dr. Adam Borison.
Dr. Borison was here for swearing in.
I believe he was.
Dr. Borison, were you here for swearing in this morning?
Yes, I was.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Will you please state and spell your name for the record?
Sure. My name is Adam, ADAM, Borison, BORISON.
Okay, and by whom are you employed?
I'm currently self-employed.
And what is your business address?
It's in California, 226 Montalvo Road, Palomar Park, California, 94062.
And you have several documents in front of you, I believe.
I do.
Okay. This is the first document labeled the direct pre-filed testimony of Adam Borison.
Yes,
Did you cause this document to be prepared?
yes, I did.
And if I were to ask you the same questions today that are posed in this document, would your answers be the same?
Yes, they would.
Do you have any corrections or additions to make to your testimony?
No, I do not.
At this time, I would move the admission. I believe we're up to CBC 4.
No objection.
CBC 4 is admitted to the record.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Borison, is there another document there with you up at the witness stand?
I also have CBC 5.
Okay, so is that labeled the pre-filed rebuttal testimony of Adam Borison?
Yes, it is.
Did you cause this document to be prepared?
Yes, I did.
And if I were to pose to you the same questions that appear in that document, would your answers today be the same?
Yes, they would.
Do you have any additions or corrections to make to your testimony?
I do have 2 corrections to the rebuttal testimony.
Well, why don't you lead us to where those are and then tell us what you're proposing to change?
Sure. The first correction change is largely on page 20. In my testimony, my rebuttal testimony, I referred to a table that Dr. Mark had included in his testimony. I read the wrong line off that table, corrected that mistake, and the text now reflects the correct interpretation of that table. That's all on page 20 of the rebuttal, ABB 20 in my, yes, of the rebuttal. Let me make sure that's correct. Yes.
Dr. Borison, what would that number change to? Is this the sentence that begins, "This figure clearly shows"?
Yes.
Okay, what would that 1% decline change to?
It changes from basically well under 1% to roughly 1%.
And you mentioned you had another change?
Yes, I should also be clear that that change I just mentioned does have cascades a little bit on other parts of the document, just because of the minor change there. The other issue on this document, it refers to the inflation forecast on page 23. And in that part of the testimony, I refer to the use of historical inflation, and I added an additional year because apparently the baseline number is earlier. So that's a change to add one more year of historical inflation.
Well, what changes about the document itself, Dr. Borison?
Exactly. On page 24, ABB 24, we add the number 7.38% for 2018.
So this would be in the sentence, the relevant historical figures for annual inflation using the Mortenson Construction Index are,
Yes, and then it starts with
and then you would insert,
7.38% for 2018.
Mr. Chairman, if Mr. Uda could just repeat what he just said, that would be.
I'm doing my best here. The relevant historical figures for annual inflation using the Mortenson Construction Index are 7.83%
So
for 2018.
7.38.
Oh, sorry, I juxtaposed those. 7.38%, is that correct, Dr. Forrison?
Yes.
So did you get that?
I did, thank you.
And one other change on page 23, I refer to the use of these treasury break-even figures, and those are shown in the graphs. In the actual forecast, the year 2022 was apparently fixed, agreed upon at 5%, which means one must recalibrate the forward years. So the actual submitted proposed inflation going forward, the figures are slightly different than the treasuries themselves. And I can give you those numbers.
Okay, but where on, what would this change on the document itself?
Page ABB 23, I would add the following sentence, if that's appropriate.
Go ahead.
With inflation in 2022 fixed at 5%, the appropriate values are 2.68% for 2023 through 2026, 2.26% from 2027 through 2031, and 2.49% from 2032 through 2042.
Everybody get that, or do we need him to repeat it? One time? Yeah. So, Dr. Borison, could you repeat that sentence one more time?
I certainly can.
Thank you.
This is the easy part. With inflation in 2022 fixed at 5%, the appropriate values are 2.68% for 2023 through 2026, 2.26% from 2027 through 2031, and 2.49% from 2032 through 2042.
Did everybody get that? Is there any other corrections you need to make to your testimony, Dr. Borison?
No.
At this time, I'd move for the admission of CBC 5.
Are there any objections?
No objection.
And CBC 5 is admitted to the record.
And I would tender Dr. Borison for
Thank
cross-examination.
you, Mr. Uda. Ms. Hill?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Dr. Borison.
Good morning.
Were you here this morning for the testimony of Mr. Schiffman?
Yes, I was.
Are you familiar with Mr. Schiffman's Exhibit 1 that shows CBC's price forecast?
I have reviewed that. I would probably want to see it again, but yes, I've reviewed it.
Do you agree with CBC's price forecast in this docket?
Yes, I agree in particular with the methodology behind it, but yes, I agree with the forecast.
Do you agree that market prices will continually increase until 2045?
I believe that the most accurate and credible forecast has that behavior. Yes.
Do you believe that the most accurate and credible forecast includes just taking the forward curves and escalating like CBC did?
I think an excellent forecast comes from the use of natural gas prices and then applying some heat rate to them. So I believe that is the appropriate approach to be taken. So I guess I think that answers the question, but if not, please try it again. Yes.
It's correct that CBC did not apply heat rate for their forecast, did they?
It applied a stable or flat heat rate.
So it's more complex than just adding the natural gas escalator?
Yes, there's two factors here. One is the belief or the understanding that a major driver of electricity prices is natural gas. That's the first observation one must make. So that's core. Once one makes that observation, then the question is, how are those related to electricity prices? And in there, the evidence, which I'm happy to talk about, is that that relationship is as likely as anything to remain flat. So that's those two steps: natural gas price, conversion to electricity. That's the appropriate way to do it.
Did Mr. Schiffman answer that second question you just presented?
I don't recall.
Do you agree with adding a carbon cost to the prices in CBC's forecast?
I don't believe I testified on carbon at all in my testimony.
Right, but you're an expert on forecasting, right?
So your question would be,
Do you agree with adding a carbon cost to these prices in Exhibit RS1?
in an effort to forecast accurately what the price might be? Is that what you're asking?
Do you agree with adding a carbon adder to the prices in Exhibit RS1?
I agree that carbon is a cost that should be added. Yes.
So do you agree with the forecast in 2031 that peak prices could reach as high as $75?
Yes.
And you agree that in 2041, peak prices could get over $100?
In nominal dollars, yes.
Would you turn to page 19 of your direct testimony? On page 19, you have a graph comparing utility forecast, correct?
Yes.
CBC's forecast is not on this chart, is it?
That's correct.
And CBC's forecast is your forecast, correct?
In that manner of speaking, yes.
Did Avista's price forecast include carbon?
I don't know. I would say my understanding is that each of these utilities makes their own choice about what to include in what assumptions to make regarding factors like carbon in their forecast.
So you don't know if these lines show a cost of carbon already baked in, do you?
That is correct.
So you can't do an apples to apples comparison of this chart and Exhibit RS1, can you?
Which is our forecast, you're saying?
Yeah, let me back up. CBC's forecast in Exhibit RS1 does not have a cost of carbon baked in, correct?
An additional cost of carbon. To the extent carbon is already included in the markets, as Mr. Schiffman pointed out, it would include those, but it does not include any additional cost of carbon.
And you're saying on page AB19, your table, you don't know whether it's in there or not.
I wouldn't characterize it quite that way. What I would say is each of these utilities makes their own assumptions about what goes into the forecast. They make different natural gas price forecasts. They make different market forecasts, different regulatory forecasts. They have their own thinking about the future. One of those issues is carbon. So that would be baked into each of those separately. But I'm not aware individually what they assumed.
Is any of that modeling of these utilities in the record?
Excuse me?
Is any of these utilities modeling of their forecast in the record?
Not that I'm aware of.
Do you recall Mr. Schiffman saying that he supports CBC's forecast because it's consistent with commission precedent?
Yes, I think that's what he said. Yes.
Do you believe that this forecast stands alone even without commission precedent as credible? Is CBC's forecast credible, ignoring commission precedent?
Yes. Would you like me to explain further, or I would say yes?
No, that's okay. I think what I'm getting at is you stand 100% behind CBC's forecast.
Yes.
Are you aware that Portland General updated its resource plan in 2021?
I believe so. I have tried to keep on top of all the updates of various IRPs, et cetera, and I believe that may have been one of them. Yes.
And didn't Portland General lower its price forecast in that update?
If that was a year ago or more, that's quite possible.
Let's switch over to inflation. I think you can look at page 31 of your direct testimony.
Yes.
And in your direct testimony, you recommended the forecast of annual inflation should be calibrated to the break-even rates derived from treasury bonds. Did I state that somewhat correctly?
Yes.
Is that still your position?
Yes.
Did you pick the Mortensen Index as a inflation tool?
I discussed that with CBC, but I did not pick that myself.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
You, Ms. Hill, Mr. Brown.
Mr. Chairman, no questions. Thank you.
Mr. Brown, Mr. Hamilton for the commission.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a few here to clarify. Dr. Borison, you testified that there's no value in diluting current information about trading days by averaging forwards across 2 consecutive periods. Do you recall that?
Yes, I do.
Do you agree that the market is subject to short-term variability?
Yes, but not necessarily with respect to long-term prices.
Okay, could you explain that for me?
Basically, if there is, let's talk about any phenomenon like weather. If there's a massive storm, cold snap here in December, there will be volatility in the marketplace. Does that affect the future price of power in 2 years from then? Well, it might if you said, I've learned something new about the weather. But if you said, no, we have cold snaps, short-term volatility happens, but no, my forward price going ahead 18 months from now should not change. So no, I would say there should not be significant volatility in long-term prices due to short-term temporary variability.
Okay. Do you acknowledge that parties could time the selection of the trading days that they ask the commission to rely upon here to take advantage of short-term swings in the price?
Again, if it's long-term prices you're looking at, that should not be possible.
Okay. Okay. So your testimony is that the commission shouldn't be concerned about parties trying to game the selection of that data.
I don't think so. I can't, of course, speak to the motives and behavior of various parties involved, but I would have to say I don't see that as a significant issue.
Okay. After the forward market period, you advocate for using a natural gas escalator to predict the market price. Is that correct?
Yes, that's a good way to do it. Yes.
Are you aware of any analysis that compares that method to just relying on an energy price forecast?
I am quite aware of a range of forecasting tools. Virtually all the tools that might be used to forecast electricity prices will have a major role for natural gas, if that's what you're asking. There would be basically very few forecasts I could see that didn't put incredible weight on the natural gas price in coming up with an electricity forecast.
Okay. I'd like to refer to pages 22 and 23 of your direct testimony. Are you there?
Yes, I am.
Okay. I believe it's on page 22 of your direct testimony that you have an image that shows, I guess it's Ascend's market heat rate forecast.
Yes.
Okay. Your testimony really focuses on the penetration of variable renewable energy and how that would not, in fact, reduce the market heat rate. Is that correct?
Let me be very clear. I am not testifying about the ultimate effect on the entire market over years when there might be 100% renewables. So, and I'm not saying they would have no effect. I want to be very clear about that. What I am saying is, to direct to your point, when looking at the penetration of variable renewables, let's say between 20 to 40%, as projected by all parties going forward, there is no evidence for a significant decline in the market heat rate. That is what I'm trying to make clear.
All right. I appreciate that. The image shown here on page 22 of your testimony also notes that I'm going to just read from the top corner of that image. Implied heat rates expected to decline to 5.1 due to large renewable penetration and coal retirements.
Yes.
Can you speak to the effect of coal retirements on the market heat rate? What would you expect that to, what effect would you expect that to have?
Well, I think it would depend a great deal on what replaced the coal. I think it could have very little effect if simply what happened it was that coal was replaced by gas, in which case there will still be a market heat rate and gas will drive it. So I don't see an obvious direction that coal retirements would put the market heat rate.
Okay, thank you. I asked this question to Mr. Schiffman, so I might as well ask it to you as well. Would it be reasonable for the commission to simply average regional utilities market price forecasts?
I don't think so. And I can't explain why. I think it's an excellent idea to calibrate. So I'm very much in favor of that. As we may have noted, these forecasts have been changed completely since they were first issued with the latest events. So you have to be very careful when looking at a forecast, both about the date of the forecast, which has a massive impact, and the assumptions behind it. So I am all in favor, as I have shown here, of comparing your forecasts, these forecasts to other forecasts, but I would not be recommending relying entirely or heavily on other parties who might have their own assumptions or own drivers behind those forecasts.
Okay, I appreciate that. Last question is about the inflation rate, and it will, I guess, depend on how I understand the change to your rebuttal testimony. So if we could refer to that last couple of pages of your testimony where that change occurred.
Sure.
And I guess page 22, to be precise, would be the place to look.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. So in your original testimony, in your original rebuttal testimony here, you described a rate that would be 3.14% for 5 years, 2.7% for 10 years, and 2.6 for 20 years.
Yes.
Right. So I'm trying to understand, is that 2.6% for 20 years a rate that would apply at every year of a 20-year term?
Oh, sorry, no, that would apply to the last 10 years of that 20-year period.
Okay. Okay. And so that's why in your correction to this rebuttal testimony, you've described the specific year ranges that each of those revised percentages would apply.
Exactly. And including fixing the first year at 5%, which is important to do.
Right.
Fixing the first year to 5%.
All right. I appreciate the clarification. That's all I have, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Hamilton. Commissioner O'Donnell, questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm having some difficulty. It seems to be confusing. It seemed to me that Mr. Schiffman was saying that the future price of electricity should not be tied to the future price of gas. But it seemed to me that you were saying exactly the opposite. So I am confused. Can you help me out? What? Okay,
Sure.
here's what I'm saying is that the future price of electricity, it's from what I've seen, is incorporated into the future price of gasoline, of natural gas rather. Okay, is that because that's one of the major sources. With the volatility right now, I'm trying to understand why there's an escalation in the future. Okay, first of all, it seems to me that escalations have always proved to be wrong and greatly wrong. When we had the price of natural gas decreasing, that was not reflected in contracts which were assuming increase escalation when the price was actually decreasing. I never could figure that out. And now it seems to be that somebody reading tea leaves has an advantage over anyone else in terms of figuring out what the cost is going to be. I'm trying to reconcile this whole thing. If the contention of the renewable industry is that it is less expensive than fossil fuels, then why are the costs escalating? I don't understand that. Especially since the goal by 2050 is to have 100% renewable energy.
I'm not sure I can answer that last question, but I certainly can address the issue of the role that natural gas might play and the prices going up. Is that a fair thing to do?
Well, let me say a little bit before. What I've said before is that as soon as the cost of natural gas, as soon as President Trump started liquefying that and sending it to Europe, it became a tool of diplomacy that put a whole different demand to domestic natural gas, and that the supply, the law of supply and demand, the supply is constrained by the fact of how your pipeline usage, whether it's maxed out, how many pipelines you have, how you can get it there and process it and everything else like that. So that comes along slowly. Okay. So as the demand increases, the price increases. Okay. It just happens that way, especially with a lot of coal plants retiring, going to natural gas. The demand has just gone through the roof. And so the price has gone up. Nobody anticipated that 5 years ago happening right there. Being that the price of natural gas is incredibly volatile for reasons of national policy, diplomatic policy, can that even be counted on at all?
I would acknowledge completely that forecasting energy prices is a difficult task, no doubt about that. I'd also say that unfortunately we are faced with doing that when we try to make investment decisions, right? When you acquire a dam, you have to look forward and say what a price is going to be. So we're in that situation. So I completely understand that. On the positive side, I'd say, despite that difficulty, there is pretty good evidence that EIA is an unbiased, at least at the moment, forecaster of prices. So while it's incredibly hard to do, they do an acceptable job of a very difficult task. So I think we, despite history and despite missing things in the past, the latest evidence I think is that they are reasonably well calibrated in an incredibly difficult world, certainly. I think second to that, I'd say, now let's talk about electricity. I think despite all this craziness of renewables and carbon and all this and all that, the relationship between gas and electricity prices has been amazingly stable. that's one of the bizarre things about it. So we keep talking, again, in this context, we keep talking about how this is going to revolutionize the market and all these things are going to change. That may be true. Sorry, that may be true. Yes. One of my weaknesses. What I would say is that in the two pieces that you need to think about in getting a forecast, one of which is gas, because gas is very important. EIA does a very good job. And the other is in tying that to an electricity price, it is remarkably stable. And so putting those two things together in a tough world is a pretty good thing to do.
Thank you. Let me ask you one other question. You mentioned about the EIA price, very, very difficult to come up with that. And you say that it's good calibration. Does it calibrate with reality? Has it been closely accurate?
In the past 20 years or so, yes. That's, again, I've looked at this for longer than that. I hate to admit it. And there's certainly been times when people criticize EIA heavily for their either being consistently one way or the other way. But the latest evidence, which they publish themselves, is that they are as wrong low as they are high over the past whatever many years. Not that they're absolutely right, but they are as wrong low as they are high. So they're not basically biased. That's what the evidence is.
Thank you. And I appreciate your statement on that you're looking back for the last 20 years. Let me ask you this. Your professional opinion, is that same thing going to hold true in the next 20 years or the next 5 years with the extraordinary volatility that's going on right now?
I would say yes, if you let me say it in this way. It's in a volatile world, as you pointed out, you're always going to be wrong at some point. The question is, on average, how are you doing? And I feel pretty good that on average, these forecasts will be good.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Doctor.
Commissioner O'Donnell, Commissioner Fielder, questions?
No, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Commissioner Pinocci. I have no questions in recross. Ms. Hill.
No questions.
Mr. Brown. So, and I guess I guess we had some cross from the commissioners. Mr. Uda.
Mr. Chairman, I don't have any redirect.
All right, thank you. Then, Dr. Borson, you are temporarily excused. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Mr. Chairman, may we take a break?
Well, we were just going to bear with me for a minute. Ms. Hill, you're going to get more than a little break. We're going to break for lunch here and we'll reconvene at 1 o'clock. Thank you all. We are off the record.